For most of human history, the most powerful man in the world could lose everything in a single afternoon. A fever, a rival's blade, a single bad decision made in anger, and the throne that once commanded armies, treasuries, and the fate of millions would simply change hands. Sometimes to a son, sometimes to a stranger, sometimes to no one at all. Today, the most powerful institutions on earth can survive 100 bad leaders in a row. Central banks outlast finance ministers. Courts outlast presidents. Corporations outlast the founders who built them from nothing. Governments hold elections, replace entire administrations, and the lights stay on the next morning. Something changed, and it wasn't the crown. It was the idea that power could be separated from the person who happened to be holding it. That authority could be built into a structure, durable, self-repairing, indifferent to who occupies the top seat. This is the story of how power learned to outlive its owners. Every early kingdom faced the same quiet emergency, one that had nothing to do with enemies at the gate. It was the question of what happens the day after the king dies. Because a kingdom built entirely around one man's judgment is a kingdom perpetually one heartbeat away from chaos. Armies loyal to him personally could fracture. Debts owed to him personally could vanish. Laws he enforced through will and memory could dissolve the moment his will and memory did. So rulers, almost by accident, began building something stranger than a monarchy. They built scribes who recorded law independent of royal memory. Treasuries that tracked wealth independent of royal appetite. Priesthoods and courts that outlived the men who founded them, because their authority came from a role, not a bloodline. None of this was designed as a rebellion against kings. It was designed to protect kings, to give their rule something sturdier than their own mortality. But there was a side effect nobody fully intended. The more these systems matured, the less they actually needed the king at all. The scribes still recorded law, whether the king was wise or foolish. The treasury still collected taxes, whether the throne was occupied by a genius or a child. Continuity had been built to serve the crown. Slowly, it started to replace it. Here is the part almost no one notices. Institutions don't just administer power. They manufacture something far more valuable: legitimacy. A king demands obedience by threat, by bloodline, by the sheer force of his presence. It works, but it's expensive to maintain and impossible to guarantee. An institution does something quieter and far more effective. It convinces people to obey the office, not the individual sitting in it. Think about what actually happens when a judge rules, a treasury sets interest rates, or a parliament passes a law. In each case, people comply not because they respect the specific human being making the decision, but because they've internalized the authority of the role itself. Replace the judge, the finance minister, the president, and the obedience continues almost unbroken because it was never really pointed at a person in the first place. This is the mechanism kings could never fully replicate. Their authority lived and died with their reputation, their bloodline, their ability to project strength. Institutional authority lives somewhere else entirely, in the shared belief that the position deserves compliance, regardless of who fills it. Once societies learned to obey roles instead of individuals, something irreversible happened. Power no longer needed a face to be respected. It only needed a structure convincing enough to be believed. If institutions weren't built to serve any one person, a harder question follows naturally. Who benefits when power moves from a throne to a system? Not the public, at least not primarily, though that's the story usually told. The real answer is quieter and less flattering. Power shifts toward the people who understand the system well enough to operate it. The administrators, the record keepers, the treasurers, the judges, the men who read the fine print no one else bothers to read. A king's court could be flattered, bribed, or intimidated by a single dominant personality. An institution is far harder to seduce because its power doesn't sit with one decision maker. It's distributed across procedures, precedents, and paperwork. But that same distribution creates a new class of quiet power holders. People who never wear a crown, never give a coronation speech, and yet often outlast the leaders who appear to rule above them. This is the trade every society unknowingly makes when it builds institutions strong enough to survive bad leadership. It gains stability, it gains predictability, but it also creates a form of power that's harder to see, harder to vote out, and harder to hold accountable because it was never designed to be personal in the first place. The throne became visible and symbolic. The real machinery moved into the background, where it has largely stayed ever since. Nowhere is this shift easier to see than in England. In the century that followed a civil war, most people remember only vaguely from a history class. By the late 1600s, English monarchs still wore the crown, still opened parliament, still appeared on the coinage. But something fundamental underneath the ceremony had already changed. Parliament now controlled taxation. Courts operated on precedent that no monarch could simply overrule. And in 1694, something happened that made the new architecture undeniable. The creation of the Bank of England, an institution built not to serve the crown's personal wealth, but to manage the nation's debt independent of whichever king or queen happened to be reigning. For the first time, a monarch could be replaced through succession, through political crisis, even through revolution, and the nation's finances, laws, and administration would continue functioning almost without interruption. The throne remained a powerful symbol, but the actual architecture of power, taxation, law, credit, administration, had relocated somewhere the crown could no longer fully reach. This is the moment worth sitting with. Not a single dramatic overthrow, but a slow transfer so complete that by the time anyone thought to ask who really runs this country, the honest answer was no longer a person at all. It was a set of interlocking institutions that had quietly outgrown the person meant to sit above them. The king still ruled in name. The system had already started ruling in practice. The same pattern didn't stay buried in the 17th century. It simply changed costumes. Watch what happens today when a central bank raises interest rates, when a Supreme Court blocks an executive order, when a corporation's board removes a founder who built the company from nothing. In every case, the same ancient mechanism is at work, a structure designed to outlast the judgment of any single person sitting at its head, even a brilliant one. This is also why strongman leadership, in any era, eventually runs into the same wall. A leader who tries to govern purely through personal will, bypassing courts, ignoring institutional checks, treating the system as an obstacle rather than a foundation, isn't fighting a rival politician. They're fighting 600 years of accumulated architecture, built specifically to survive people exactly like them. Sometimes that architecture bends. Occasionally it breaks. But history's pattern is remarkably consistent. Nations with strong institutions tend to absorb bad leadership the way a ship absorbs a wave, shaken but still afloat. Nations without that architecture tend to capsize with the leader because there was never anything beneath him to catch the fall. The throne room never disappeared. It just moved into boardrooms, courtrooms, and central bank meetings. Rooms without crowns, but with far more staying power than any crown ever had. Strip away the kings, the parliaments, the banks, and the boardrooms, and one principle remains underneath all of it. Power that depends on a single person is borrowed power. It can be brilliant, even transformative, but it expires the moment that person does, through death, disgrace, or simply the passage of time. Power that's built into a system is inherited power. It doesn't need to be brilliant. It only needs to be durable enough to survive the people who temporarily hold it. This is why empires built entirely around one conqueror tend to fracture the instant he's gone, while nations built around institutions can absorb catastrophic leadership and still wake up functioning the next morning. It's not that institutions are wiser than kings. It's that they were never designed to depend on wisdom in the first place, only on structure. That's the upgrade this documentary was really about. Not a history of monarchy fading into bureaucracy, but a permanent shift in how power itself learned to survive. Every ruler eventually learns the same lesson, usually too late to act on it. You can command an army, you can silence a rival, you can hold a nation's fear in the palm of your hand, and for a while, that will look indistinguishable from real power. But there is one force no crown has ever been able to command, bribe, or intimidate: time. And time is the one variable every institution was quietly engineered to survive. This is the part that's easy to miss, because power that lives in a person is loud. It has a face, a voice, a throne room, a name people either fear or admire. Power that lives in a system is nearly invisible by comparison. A treasury ledger, a court precedent, a central bank meeting nobody outside finance pays attention to. But invisibility was never a weakness. It was the design. Systems don't need to be seen to be obeyed. They only need to be believed. That's the quiet trade every advanced society has made, often without ever voting on it directly. In exchange for stability, for the ability to survive a bad decade, a corrupt administration, a leader who never should have held the office, societies handed real authority to structures no single person fully controls. Not because those structures are wiser than the individuals they replaced, but because they were never built to depend on wisdom in the first place. Only on continuity, which is why the crown in every era was always something of an illusion. Not fake, exactly, but incomplete. It was the part of power visible enough to put on a coin, a portrait, a headline. The actual architecture, the incentives, the paperwork, the quiet machinery that decides what actually happens the day after the ceremony ends, was always somewhere else. Somewhere it still is today, in boardrooms and courtrooms and institutions with far less spectacle and far more staying power than any throne ever had. Perhaps that's the real reason revolutions so often fail to change as much as they promise. They can remove the person sitting at the top. They rarely touch the architecture beneath him. An architecture, unlike a ruler, doesn't need anyone's permission to keep standing. Power rarely announces itself. More often, it survives by becoming part of the ordinary. The names change. The architecture remains.